Mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on chemical inventory management. We're glad you could join us. My name's James, I'm the webinar event coordinator at Triumvirate Environmental, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a brief overview on what the webinar is going to entail as we run through just a few housekeeping items. So you'll see here that everyone's microphones will be turned off for the entirety of the webinar, but know that you can communicate using the Questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen in the webinar panel. Following the presentation, there will be an open question and answer period. You can ask questions anytime throughout the webinar by typing them into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Any unanswered questions will be followed up on after the webinar in the coming days. Finally, we will be announcing an offer at the end of the webinar to help assess your chemical inventory program and identify any problem areas or areas for improvement, so please stick around for that. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Skylar Stewart. Skylar's worked at Triumvirate for 6 years, and he's currently working as an account manager for TEI's life sciences, biotech, and pharmaceutical clients. Skylar's managed the rollout and implementation of many chemical inventory programs at clients from world-class enterprise pharmaceutical companies to biotech startups. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Skylar. Hey, Skylar.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everybody. And as I am a resident expert on chemical inventories, I've done quite a few of them over the years in different capacities. So I know a lot about setting them up and some of the intricacies involved in running those systems. But full disclosure, an area I'm not an expert in is specifically the chemical inventory softwares that are out there. I know a bit about them, but if you have any specific questions about how those softwares run or particular applications that they have, I would say it'd be important to reach out to a representative from one of those companies, as they'll be better equipped to answer those questions for you. So with that, I wanted to go over what our learning objectives are for the day. So we're going to take a look at some of the regulatory drivers behind setting up a chemical inventory. We'll also take a look at some of the financial and operational drivers. We're going to take a look at how to improve on-site safety and compliance and reduce costs through the implementation of a chemical inventory. We'll take a look at the chemical inventory life cycle, and then we'll talk a little bit about planning and strategy development through the use of the chemical inventory. So a quick poll question before we get going. What is your greatest challenge when it comes to managing your chemical inventory? Give you all a minute or so to answer.
Yep, and we just launched that poll, and you'll see the options there: maintaining accurate inventory, selecting a management software program, creating and managing the project team, and rolling out the program. And you can select other if your greatest challenge isn't listed. Give everyone a few more seconds. All right, looks like just about everybody voted here. I'll share the results. As you can see, overwhelmingly, maintaining accurate inventory is the greatest challenge at 70%. There you go, Skylar.
Awesome. Thanks. That's not too surprising. That's a common one that we run into, and it can be quite a challenge depending on how your inventory program is set up or how your organization is set up. So we'll touch on that a little bit towards the end of the presentation, and hopefully it can answer some of your questions or concerns there. So let's just quickly go over the agenda. First, we're going to talk about the regulatory landscape a little bit. Then we'll get into organizational drivers. We'll talk about the program launch, and then we'll get into actually managing your chemical inventory, and then we'll talk about reviewing and optimization of those programs, with hopefully a few minutes at the end for some questions and answers. So the regulatory landscape, there's 4 entities that are really a part of this. There's the EPA, specifically through EPCRA, or the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. OSHA, which has to do with hazard communication for employees. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security, specifically through CFATS, or the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards. And then there's also local authorities such as fire departments or any wastewater agencies that are out there. So we'll start out with EPCRA. I want to touch on this, but I don't want to dive too deep because it gets murky pretty quick. But EPCRA is codified in 40 CFR in parts 355, 370, and 372. Talks about emergency planning and notification, hazardous chemical reporting, and toxic chemical release reporting, all centered around the community right to know. And all this community right to know deals with specifically State Emergency Response Commission, or SERC, S-E-R-C. And it also has to do with your local emergency planning committees, or the LEPCs. But basically what your chemical inventory can do is it can provide information that's necessary to complete a lot of reports that need to be communicated to these groups or to the EPA in general. Such reports include your toxic release inventory, your TRIs, or Tier 2 reporting. But there are also other reporting requirements that you could be reporting, I guess, groups that you could be kicked into as a generator, and that's all based on your usage, storage, or the quantities of certain chemicals that you have on site. So it's important to have a chemical inventory to prepare yourself for some of those reporting requirements that you're most likely going to encounter down the road. So OSHA, an employee right to know. So OSHA outlines through its hazardous communication standard and its lab standard that employers must develop systems to identify chemicals and the associated hazards in the workplace, which must be communicated to employees. So OSHA, you can read between the lines there, and it says that pretty much OSHA does not mandate that you use a chemical inventory. However, it's almost impossible to communicate the hazards on site with employees without a chemical inventory. So though it's not mandated, it's pretty much a necessity to be able to achieve what OSHA is asking you to do. The Department of Homeland Security and CFATS. So the purpose of this rule is to gain information about facilities possessing specific chemicals. They want to identify high-risk chemical facilities based on risk-based performance standards. And the whole goal is to improve security of high-risk chemical facilities. So basically what determines whether you're one of these high-risk facilities is if you have chemicals that are on the list of chemicals of interest, or COIs. If you have these, it may put you under CFAT reporting requirements if you exceed a screening threshold quantity. Basically, if you're using or storing chemicals in a specific way that exceed these quantities, can kick you into reporting categories that are going to have you submit site security plans or site vulnerability assessments to the Department of Homeland Security. So it's always good to take a look at this, even if you don't think you have chemicals that are on this list. You might someday have them or have them in quantities that will kick you into a reporting category. So there's a tool down below that's available through this hyperlink. That's provided by the Department of Homeland Security, and it helps you determine if you need to report, and if you do, it provides you the guidance as to what information you'll need to provide and how to exactly do that. So I think an important, you can actually just Google COIs or chemicals of interest, and you can see that list. And the one thing you'll notice right off the bat is there are some pretty common chemicals that you probably already have on site on that list, but really what's important is how you're storing or how you're using those chemicals, and what the quantities are on site. That can really make the difference whether you fall into this category of being a high-risk chemical facility. So it's worth taking a look at, even if you don't think that you fall into that category right away. So getting into the down to the local level a little bit, we want to talk about flammable permits. This is something that pretty much all of you probably have come into contact with before or know a little bit about. But facilities must maintain flammable levels at or below your permit levels. And this is all according to state building codes that provide specific parameters on volumes and locations of flammable materials. They get broken out into what's called flammable control zones. and that's based on the flammable class and how much volume there is, and what you can keep in certain zones. If you have a lot of highly flammable class 1A material, that can really affect how much you can keep in a control zone. If you don't have as much of that material, but you have a lot of lower flash point material, it's a little bit easier to manage that stuff. But control zones can get pretty complicated pretty quickly, depending on how your building is laid out and according to your local or regional guidelines. So there are some things that you can do that can help you manage that as well. You can install H rooms or high hazard rooms. They essentially negate whatever is in there according to your flammable permit because they're specifically rated to hold that material. So that can help. Those can be kind of expensive though. Another cheaper option is flame cabinets. If you install a certain number of flame cabinets and you put material in there, it can help reduce the levels of flammables that are considered to be within a control zone. But one important thing to not lose sight of is waste counts. I see a lot of clients oftentimes forget to include hazardous waste in their flammable permits. So if you have a lot of flammables on site, the chances are you're going to have a lot of flammable waste that come out of there as well. So it's important to know what those volumes are, where they are, what control zone they're in, and how that waste is classified. Is it highly flammable or is it just combustible? All those things will have an impact, and usually they're higher volumes too, so it can really kick you out of compliance pretty quickly if you don't pay attention to that. So now I want to talk about the Clean Water Act and your discharge permits. So you have to apply for a NPDES permit or a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit through the EPA. And you also have to apply for discharge permits for your local POTWs, or your publicly owned treatment works, and any other local authorities that are in place. Massachusetts in particular has the MWRA, which is the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority. Some states operate under the EPA, but most have some sort of state authority that you'll need to apply for permits with. So it's pretty important to figure out who you're going to be reporting to there. And each entity will be inquiring about specific chemicals, and some are actually going to require a full chemical inventory when you're applying for your discharge permits. So if you have a full chemical inventory before you apply for the permit, it can be helpful in streamlining the process and making it as efficient as possible. So moving away from the regulatory landscape, I want to move into organizational drivers next. So the main organizational drivers behind implementing a chemical inventory are your purchasing department, your R&D, your manufacturing, and your environmental and health and safety group. So purchasing basically just looking at procurement options can help prevent over-purchasing by employees. So knowing what's in your chemical inventory can help employees manage what they're ordering and keep your inventory from growing out of control. It's just a good safety measure to have in place, because if people are ordering chemicals and don't know what's on site and just keep ordering, it can get out of hand pretty quickly. So having some sort of procurement or purchasing link with your chemical inventory can be pretty beneficial. And then specifically with R&D, a lot of times researchers are ordering chemicals for specific projects that may be short-term or long-term. If they're shorter term, they may order something that they only use maybe a quarter of a bottle, and if there's another researcher a couple benches down that's doing something similar, they can, a lot of times if they don't know that chemical is already in circulation throughout the department, they can order the chemical separately and use a quarter of the bottle as well. Now you have 2 bottles that were ordered and 2 bottles that need to be disposed of instead of 1. So if there's some sort of inventory in place, they can kind of communicate with each other and kind of condense resources a little bit and help save some money for you there too. Manufacturing, the best way to kind of describe this is to kind of explain a scenario that I experienced in the past. I was working on site for one of our clients, and the manufacturing group, they were ordering pallets of materials, as they always want to make sure that they have enough material on site in order to handle the output that they need to produce. They had a standing order for something like 5 pallets a week, and they were getting that in, and then they started changing their manufacturing process a little bit, and really only required 3 pallets per week. And that hadn't really been communicated properly through all the right channels. So the shipping and receiving department didn't really accommodate for that, so they kept ordering the same amount. So there started to be a buildup, and we noticed that from a disposal standpoint, we were shipping out pallets of this material that was coming in on the other side of the building. We were receiving it in the same condition, packaged already ready to go. So we noticed there was quite a bit of oversight there, and having a chemical inventory in place could have helped a little bit there. We eventually figured it out, and we were able to streamline the process and bridge that gap in communication a little bit. But for a while there was a pretty big oversight, and there was a lot of money lost and a lot of waste being produced for no real good reason. And then through your environmental health and safety department, I think the biggest thing with that is having an accurate chemical inventory can provide your environmental health and safety department with the ability to create accurate reports for compliance and safety. The bottom line for an EHS department is that the more chemicals that are on site, the more of a compliance and safety risk there is. So minimizing the amount of chemicals on site can really mitigate the risk that's out there for you. So now I want to get into the chemical inventory life cycle. I want to talk about the purpose and the reasoning behind implementing a chemical inventory, your process for setting it up, how you're going to launch it, how you manage it from a day-to-day perspective, and then reviewing and optimizing your chemical inventory program to ensure that it's achieving its original purpose as efficiently as possible. So the purpose is really why you're embarking on this endeavor. Why are you trying to create a chemical inventory? What are your goals, and what are you trying to achieve? What objectives are you looking to achieve? So in identifying this, you want to create a chemical inventory project team. So it's usually a small group of people. It could just be you. It could be just one person managing the whole thing. But it's usually helpful to have a few people involved. You want to keep that team under 5 people, even though there's a lot more stakeholders out there. Keeping the decision makers, at least to a team smaller than 5, is usually the most productive of use of everybody's time. If you get more than 5 people, there can be a lot of debate, and decision making can get slowed down quite a bit. So less than 5 people is good. But the goal of that team should be really to figure out what are the needs and expectations of your stakeholders, what are they looking to get out of a chemical inventory, and how do you ensure their commitment to the project. Because you really want to make sure you're building coalitions for this inventory, and you're not building walls that are going to get in your way as you try to move forward with the project or program. So what I mean by the process is really what types of chemicals you're going to be inventorying, what are the logistics going to be behind it, and who are the departmental users that are going to be involved in this. So as far as types of chemicals, the questions you need to be asking is, what are you setting up your chemical inventory for? Or is it just for a flammable permit? If so, are you only going to inventory flammables? Do you want to do just hazardous chemicals? Do you want haz and non-haz chemicals? Do you want to get into consumables? things with high turnover rates like kits. How deep do you want to dive on that? We'll talk about a little bit about that more in a minute, but figuring that out in the front end is pretty important. And then what the logistics behind it? Is your company a centralized company? Is it decentralized? What are the size or numbers of the buildings? How many rooms are there? Where are your storage areas? How is purchasing involved with everything? And then who are the users? Chemistry, biology, researchers, or facilities, environmental health and safety, again, purchasing, shipping, receiving, who's going to be using this into what capacity. So quick little story about, some of how, an example of how I experienced this in the past was I was working with a fairly large pharmaceutical company here in Cambridge. They're fairly decentralized, which was our first major problem. We were trying to figure out a way to inventory all the chemicals as they were coming in, but because there was a number of different buildings, it was pretty difficult to make sure that we were catching all these chemicals as they came in. It meant we had to be in 4 or 5 different buildings at the same time. Deliveries didn't always happen at the same time, so it became kind of a nightmare to manage. So we had to really sit down and assess how we were going to productively do this. So we really had to locate what I like to call the bottleneck, or the one area where all chemicals are going to go through before they spread out to other buildings or throughout labs or within labs, or before they get all over your campus. Where are they going to go first? So we traced it back and to the source and realized that the only way we were going to see all the chemicals for sure at the same time would be at the warehouse for this company, which was across town. So we were sending a couple people over there daily to try to capture all these chemicals, and that actually worked out pretty well with us. For us, we talked to the shipping and receiving folks over there, and some of the facilities guys, and they were able to help us out and separate those chemicals out as they came in, and then our team would go there, inventory all those chemicals, and when they were set, we'd return them back to a specific space where shipping and receiving would then take them and distribute them throughout the campus. So it became the most efficient way to make sure we were capturing all chemicals that were coming in, which is really the first step in making sure that you're maintaining an accurate inventory, that you're getting everything into the inventory that's coming onto your campus. So that's just a quick example of how you deal with a centralized versus decentralized campus, and some of the people that have to be involved in accomplishing that goal. So now the other part of the process is, what type of inventory software are you going to use? So this is probably one of the areas that people have a lot of questions on, and there's a high focus on, but there's a reason why it's kind of coming this late in the presentation. And it's really because we want to make sure you're asking yourself all the questions that we were talking about earlier, and making sure that you're really figuring out why you're implementing the use of the chemical inventory, and kind of some of the logistics behind it, because that's really going to help you be able to match yourself with the best chemical inventory out there. This is a list of some of the chemical inventory systems that are out there. They all have their different benefits. They're all a little bit different. So depending on what specific use you need, any one of these could be the best solution for you. So just to quickly run through them, the most basic version is a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. Super cheap to implement. It can cover your basic reporting requirements if you're trying to get a flame permit or wastewater permit. It can help with that stuff pretty well. But it doesn't have a lot of the other capabilities that these other more expensive inventories have. So it's good, but it's very limited in what it can actually do. SysPro, ChemSW, MSDS Online, these softwares are pretty good at managing chemical flow from one place to another within your facility, and they're really good at managing like MSDSs and giving you online access to those. So if that's what you're really concerned about, those can be good options for you. Cambridge Soft is another good one, especially if it's going to be heavily researcher-based software. If they're going to have researchers using it quite a bit, they typically like this one a lot more. One of the main reasons is it has ChemDraw, so researchers can search for chemicals by chemical structure. So that can be pretty beneficial when they're trying to come up with new structures and all that stuff. So they typically like that quite a bit. So if it's going to be researcher use, that can be a pretty good option for you. SciQuest has a few different ones out there. It has ERM, Enterprise Reagent Manager, and SiteHawk is another one. ERM in particular I've worked with quite a bit, and that's that one's really good for procurement management and linking up with things like Oracle. So if you're really looking for that procurement link, that could be a good option for you. Another one is chemical safety. So this is a pretty good compromise if you're a small to mid-size company that's looking for something a little bit more robust than a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, but maybe doesn't have all the bells and whistles of some of these more expensive softwares. Some of these other ones can get pretty expensive pretty quick, $30,000 to $40,000 to $50,000 for some of these programs. Chemical safety is a little bit more on the lower budget end, but it does have more than an Excel spreadsheet would, so it can be a good option depending on where you are with that. And then there's also internally developed systems. So these are ones that are developed on-site specific for your site. They can be very resource dependent and can get pretty expensive, and you have to have a really good IT capable person to kind of manage that. So that's those are the cons, but the pro is that it gets designed specifically for your site and what you need it for, so it's highly customizable. So those are some of the programs that are out there, but again, really the key to success with picking a software is making sure that you really understand what your needs are, and then research which one of these softwares can most effectively match your needs. And I would definitely suggest beta testing any one of these softwares before purchasing it, just so you can actually experience how it's going to work and how the interface is before committing to a purchase. And it'd be good to get some researchers involved in that too as well, if at all possible. So now I want to talk about the program launch. So this launch is going to talk about the data collection and management strategy, and also assign responsibilities to specific stakeholders that are going to be involved in this chemical inventory program. So to do this, you're going to want to create an inventory map, and that's basically creating a strategy to collect your data. You want to identify what is going to be inventoried. We talked a little bit about this before, but gets more specific than just non-haz or hazardous chemicals. Talking about consumables and kits, like I mentioned before. Some people don't really want to inventory consumables because there's such a high turnover rate that it seems kind of pointless to do that. Other people argue that stuff like kits do have hazardous chemicals in them, and they should be inventoried regardless of the time and energy that it takes to inventory those. It all depends on what your internal policies are and what your capabilities are. But it's really important to figure that out on the front end, so you're not figuring it out as you're trying to implement your inventory and figuring it out on the fly, or making changes from the start, because that can slow you down quite a bit with this launch. You also want to create location guides. So you want to know, you want to figure out where these chemicals are going to be stored, and how specific do you want to be. Do you want to just figure out what labs they're going into and have those be the locations, or do you want to get down to more specifically benches, cabinets, fridges, freezers, desiccators, How specific do you want to be, and how specific do you want to be with tracking those chemicals moving from lab to lab or within a lab. It's important to figure that out as well. And then you also want to notify the lab personnel. It's really important to make sure that you're creating allies, not adversaries, for your chemical inventory program. So transparency is really important. Making sure that lab personnel understand what you're doing, why it's important, and how it can benefit them is pretty important. If they don't understand those things, they're probably just going to see what you're doing as getting in their way or preventing them from doing their job more effectively. And then if that happens, you're going to see a lot of resistance in setting up your chemical inventory. So transparency and communication is pretty important. And then you also want to prepare equipment and supplies beforehand. So assessing things like laptops, scanners, barcode printers, some of these physical things are going to help you actually inventory this material, and how you want it set up. If researchers are going to be doing a lot of the inventorying, does it make sense to have a computer set up in each lab with a scanner so that that's where all that data transfer can happen? Does it make sense to have a mobile inventory unit, like a laptop with a scanner and barcode printer that's on a cart that can be brought throughout all the labs by a facilities person, an EHS person, or a contractor? Just really want to think about all those logistics and the physical equipment behind this before you get started. Because if you don't have the right equipment to start the task, once you start, the chemicals are going to keep coming in, and if you're ill-equipped to inventory them, it's going to get out of control pretty quick and pretty hard to catch up. And then you also want to create a sustainable plan to inventory new chemicals as they arrive on site. So again, finding that bottleneck where all chemicals go before they spread out over your campus is pretty important. There's other ways to do it. You don't have to do it that way, but to me, that's the easiest way to do it right off the bat. And if you identify more efficient ways down the road, that's part of this constant assessment and looking at how you can improve your inventory. But finding that bottleneck is a good first step to ensure that you're at least getting everything coming on site. So launching, talking about stakeholders and communication, again, can't overemphasize how important it is to communicate with your stakeholders. Inventories are not a perfect thing, so meeting with your stakeholders regularly and keeping them informed of policy and procedure changes is pretty important. Things are going to change as you move along, and if you don't keep your stakeholders in the loop with what's happening, they'll be operating according to outdated procedures and policies, and they'll be counterproductive to your inventory program, whether they mean to or not. So really communicating that is going to be important, and also training new people appropriately as well is very important, so they're not counterproductive to your inventory as they come in as well. So now we want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of managing your chemical inventory. But before we do that, I want to just throw another poll question out there. And this question is, how often do you inventory your chemicals?
And same deal here. So this is our second and final poll of the webinar. I'm going to have Skylar kind of comment on what he recommends and why. But we just want to gauge where everybody's at in terms of your inventory and frequency. All right, just about there. So we're going to push these results out, and 67% review annually. So that's good, and 15% more than once a year, 11% almost never, and another 7% once every couple of years or so.
So that's good. I mean, that shows that most people are doing this at least annually, if not more. I would definitely suggest doing a chemical inventory annually, if possible. just because there's a lot that can happen within a year. And also for, if you have highly hazardous chemicals on site or things like peroxide formers, that stuff, a year mark is a good time to be looking at all that for disposal purposes and clean out purposes. This is really a safety and compliance thing. And if you can do it more than that, even better, but at least once a year is what I would suggest, depending on what your constraints are. And obviously, everybody's situation is a little bit different, but annually should be what you're shooting for if possible. So I want to get into managing your inventory now. So you're going to need a sustainable system for tracking chemicals in, out, and throughout your facility. And you're going to have to identify the correct stakeholders to manage that data and keep up with the routine management of the program. And that's done through things like a chemical inventory reconciliation. So sometimes doing a chemical inventory and doing a reconciliation, sometimes those words can be interchangeable depending on how you do it. If you just do a chemical inventory annually or less than that, don't necessarily consider that a reconciliation. How the word is thrown around, at least how I've heard it, is that reconciliations doing it on more of a routine basis and reassessing what's actually on site. And the managing of chemicals coming in and out is more of just the day-to-day management of doing chemical inventory. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. Maybe I just confused more people there. But so one last thing on this slide, when you're identifying the correct stakeholders to manage the data, I just want to make sure that everyone kind of remembers that whoever you pick out to be helping you manage this data and manage these chemicals should be trained appropriately. We are dealing with potentially hazardous chemicals here, so having the proper safety training in place for those people that are going to be handling this stuff is pretty important. And sometimes it can get overlooked when we're delegating out tasks to different groups and don't necessarily know right away how much they're going to be involved or who's actually going to be handling what until the process gets going. So it's just important to assess that as you start and as you go. So again, managing your inventory, you want to track chemicals, inventorying materials upon arrival. So this is a crucial point. If the more chemicals that you're getting into the inventory as they come in, the more accurate your chemical inventory is going to be. Reassigning locations as chemicals move throughout your facility can be pretty important. Down below we talk about managing flammable control zones. If you get material that's moving from one area to another and you're not tracking that, you can get buildup of materials in certain zones, and if you have a flammable zone that's getting an accumulation of flammables, if you're not tracking that, you might not realize that you exceed your flammable permit, and you can run into some compliance issues there. And then also you want to make sure you're removing chemicals from the system when you're disposing of them. So you can really utilize your chemical inventory program to help you get rid of expired material, high haz material, any P-listed material. It's really good to keep a clean house, and these inventories are a good way to monitor that and help you do that. So a really effective way to help manage these chemicals getting scanned out of your system when they're disposed of is to make it as easy as possible for your stakeholders to contribute to the project. So the use of like barcode books or clipboards can make scan outs pretty easy. So getting a piece of paper or anything that barcodes can be removed from the chemical and placed on that and then scanned out during routine chemical inventory or a reconciliation that's on a quarterly or annual basis is pretty important. If you put those things near disposal sites like waste cabinets, designated waste pickup areas, or by recycling bins, you're going to get a lot more participation from the stakeholders because you're making it easier for them just to take it off and put that on that clipboard as they go. Otherwise, that stuff just ends up in the recycling bins or going out as chemical waste, and then that stuff doesn't get scanned out, and you get a runaway chemical inventory and a buildup of chemicals that aren't actually there. And when that happens, you can actually put yourself into some some categories for reporting that you don't necessarily need to be in, but your inventory is telling you have to be in just because it wasn't managed correctly. So talking a little bit more about chemical reconciliation, I suggest that if you're able to, and it makes sense, you should perform it at least annually. You can do this through a rolling process or a snapshot. Smaller companies usually do a snapshot, just do a one-time chemical inventory at some point during the year. Some people do it over the summer. Some people do it right at the end of the year. Some do it right at the beginning of the year, and that gives you just one snapshot of time during the year where that chemical inventory is fully accurate. Or you can do a rolling process. Bigger companies that have a lot more chemicals on site typically implement the use of a rolling process and prepare a reconciliation schedule. So they'll set it up where, so if you've got a couple buildings and a lot of different departments, they'll say building 1, chemistry floors 1, 2, and 3 get inventoried in January. Floors 3, 4, 5 go in February, and then biology in building 2 goes in March, and so on and so forth. That way, all the chemicals get inventoried at least once a year, but it becomes a manageable process instead of being a full-time job for 3 months out of the year. So you definitely want to prepare a reconciliation schedule for that, and stick to it as strictly as you can. It's really easy to let chemical reconciliation get on the back burner, but if you do that, it can build up and become a monumental task later on and take a solid month of effort to get back on track. So keeping up with it's pretty important. And then also you should expect the unexpected and schedule some extra time between areas that you're reconciling. The point of this reconciliation is to also show you where, reveal how well the system is working, show you where improvements can be made or where there's inefficiencies. So you should expect the unexpected and be prepared for some of that stuff to not be quite right, and allot yourself some time to make adjustments along the way. So a lot of those inefficiencies can delay the reconciliation schedule, so preparing and having time is pretty important. So reviewing and optimizing of your program. So the review and optimization really consists of your written plans, your training, your on-site chemical management, and the ordering of chemicals. They're all kind of intertwined, but it's really important that as you go through and do your reconciliations, or just doing your chemical inventory as you go, as chemicals are coming in or leaving, you're going to discover a lot of inefficiencies in the program. So as you change processes and protocols, you've got to make sure that you're updating all your written plans to reflect that, and that all that gets transferred over to your training, so that current stakeholders that are currently helping out with your chemical inventory, make sure when changes are made to those written plans, that's communicated to them. And then when new folks come on site, new researchers or any interns maybe that come in, it's important that they get the right training as well, because if they're not trained accordingly, they can kind of wreak havoc on your chemical inventory program by kind of just doing whatever they want to do. So it's really important to make sure those things are in sync. And then there's the on-site chemical management part. Like we said, they're a fluid changing thing, the inventories. It's important to assess the logistics around scanning chemicals in and out throughout the facility routinely. If you don't, you can have a lot of unseen inefficiencies that that build up and really affect the integrity of your program and its effectiveness. And then the last part is ordering chemicals. So this, if you have the right on-site chemical management, right training, the right written plans, ordering chemicals should go according to plan, but they don't always. So a lot of times people that aren't trained right or don't have the right understanding of the chemical inventory will start circumnavigating the chemical inventory, and they'll just order chemicals outside of that and not follow the protocols that they should be to get those inventoried, and that can really deteriorate the integrity of your program as well. If they understand why you're doing the inventory, why it's important, they have accessibility to the plans and the training, they'll order through your channels, and we'll be able to make sure that that stuff gets inventoried as it comes in, and that'll help quite a bit. So the written plans, training, on-site chemical management, and the ordering of chemicals is all pretty crucial to the reviewing and optimization of your program and making sure that that achieves the overall purpose and goals that you set out to originally. So you'll have to tweak these things here and there. There's no chemical inventory is perfect the first time you roll it out, but as you tweak it and as you go through, you're going to see that you get closer and closer to achieving the goals and the purpose that you set out to complete originally. So I think that's it for the review and optimization. So now we can go to some questions if you guys have any of them.
Thank you, Skylar. Yes, we do. We have a couple of questions that have come in so far as you were speaking. I know there's probably more out there, so while we've got Skylar for about 13 more minutes, I'll encourage you to ask your question and get it in. I saw hands go up a couple times. Just keep in mind that everyone is on mute, so instead ask that you please type in your question using the questions box. This way you get it in, and we can ask Skylar with the time that we have. So to start, Skylar, first question is, we're a small company, very small generator. Is it acceptable to not perform an annual inventory, or is it still recommended that we perform these annually?
So I would suggest that regardless of your generator size, you try to do the chemical inventories annually. If there's certain constraints and it has to be done less than that, then it's fine. But that type of stuff, it can get out of control pretty quickly. And from a safety standpoint, I talked about some high haz stuff and peroxide formers. It's good to be monitoring that on an annual basis to make sure that that stuff continually gets moved out of your organization.
Great. And Eric wants to know if you have a sample inventory map or template. I know you spoke about that a few slides back.
I don't have anything on hand, but I don't have anything that specifically outlines that. It's kind of tricky because it really all depends on your specific situation, and the map should really be tailored to what your setup is, and that's something we help people set up that type of stuff and kind of come up with those plans. So yes and no.
Yeah.
We do have material on it, but most of that belongs to our clients, and don't really have a lot of access to that. But we could help you set up an inventory map for sure.
That's a good point. So we can reach out to you, Brian, and see what your specific needs are and how we can help you customize a map for your chemical inventory. Skylar, a couple people are asking about the inventory itself and performing it. So can you speak briefly? I know you mentioned we do this for some clients. How the program is launched typically, how long the inventory should take, any parameters or standards that are typically set to set expectations, and how Triumvirate can help streamline the process.
Yeah, so really the launch, the more effort you put in on the front end, the quicker things will go. But there's a lot of things to take in consideration: the size of your company, how many chemicals are on site, can all make a pretty big difference in what that time frame is going to look like. You know, there's some places that have a pretty small footprint. For example, I was just looking at a chemical inventory a couple weeks ago at a pretty small facility, and I had it in my head that this should only take 2 people, probably 4 or 5 days to complete this inventory. I went there, scoped it out, looked through all the labs, and looked through their inventory room, and I was completely amazed at how many chemicals they had packed into this facility. There was a ton of chemicals, you know, thousands. So I realized that it was going to take probably 3 people, close to 7 days to do that afterwards. So really knowing how many chemicals you have on site is going to be important, and obviously if you have more people working on it, it can be done faster. So making sure you have like a right number of laptops to be working on this stuff, the right number of licenses to access the software. So if you have a software and you're only given 3 or 4 licenses for administrative purposes, you know, right off the bat, sometimes it's beneficial to ask for additional licenses, even if it's only for a short time. That way you can have more people working on the inventory right at the beginning, and it helps you get through that process quicker, and then you only need a few licenses to maintain it moving forward. So now, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. Great insights. I think you gave us a look at what we can expect. And a question from Laura here, which is an interesting one. For an out-of-control inventory, what are your suggestions for choosing things to cull out of the herd? And what can I say to convince researchers to get rid of items that are 20 or more years old?
Safety is the biggest thing. I think everybody, you know, when it comes down to financials and logistics and what makes life more difficult for certain people, researchers tend to not be as interested in that. But I think everybody in general is very interested in safety and having old, expired chemicals on site. I mean, I'm not a researcher, so I can't say, but I know I've talked to a lot of them, and working with expired materials isn't really a good process or procedure. But safety is the biggest thing, because old chemicals bottles can get compromised. You know, they break easier. They start reacting with each other. You know, it can lead to a lot of issues. If you don't know what's on site, you don't know where things are. When we do chemical inventories, we often find a ton of stuff that people didn't know was there. Explosives, highly reactive chemicals stored next to each other. A lot of safety concerns. So that's usually the universal communicator with people. So I would definitely start there.
Great. I think you just answered the next question, or at least touched on it. Is it a plausible strategy to try to control ordering of certain types of hazardous chemicals in the interest of safety? That's from Julie.
Yeah. So this is where you know, I will mention that I have worked with ERM quite a bit through CFATS, and they have a link that links up with their procurement, and I know for a fact that that system can flag chemicals as they come in and as they're moved around your site. And I think a lot of other inventories have that capability as well, but you can flag that stuff so you can quickly run reports to see how much of that stuff is on site, where it is, how old it is. It makes it a lot easier to maintain that stuff and keep it organized and get it out the door when it's expired. So flagging high-haz chemicals is another benefit of a lot of these softwares.
Awesome. Good advice. And Skylar, we'll take one more question. There were a few that came in about the slide deck, and yes, we will be sending out the slide deck, a link to the presentation tomorrow. You'll also get a link to the recording and some other materials. So if you stick around for a sec, we're going to move on to the next slide after we answer this question. Actually, Skylar, we could probably move on to the next slide here. And just know that you will get these materials tomorrow. Our final question is, what field do you recommend putting in the chemical inventory? For example, trade name, chemical name, supplier, etc.
So yeah, you definitely want to have your chemical name, quantity, hazard associated with it. If it's flammable material, you want to get as much information as possible, like what flammable class it is, and some inventories are better at it. You can even, if you have a robust Excel sheet, it can even help with this, calculating like your flammable limits and stuff like that. But you can also track for high haz chemicals. You can track like dates and stuff like that. Get a list of dates, but definitely the name, the catalog number if possible, the CAS number, the size, the quantity, and then where that chemical is in your facility as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Skylar, for your thorough presentation. I hope everyone took something away from this, and hopefully are on the right track. It seems like the majority are doing chemical inventories annually, but if there are challenges, I encourage you to reach out. As Skylar said, we do these on a regular basis. So in addition to the materials that were presented today, we're going to be sending you a survey. Please let us know what you thought of the webinar. We appreciate your feedback. It helps us to improve on these as we go forward. And also a link for a complimentary chemical inventory assessment. As part of this initial assessment, our experts will conduct a walkthrough of your facility and review all of your chemical inventory documentation, as well as provide a preliminary report with suggestions for improvements. So if you're interested in that, I'll ask you to just state yes in the questions box, provide your phone number if you wish. If you want to think about it, we'll send you a link with a form tomorrow to sign up for that, and remember, it is complimentary. And in addition to chemical inventory management services, we perform hazardous waste disposal, emergency response, lab moves, among other EHS services. So feel free to give us a call. We've got a phone number there, our website, and I've included Skylar's email address in addition, so that you can ask him any other questions that you have following today's presentation. So that concludes our webinar today. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your questions. We hope that you'll join us again soon. You'll expect that email tomorrow, and we hope you have a good rest of the day. Skylar, anything else to state?
No, that's it. Thanks for attending, and hopefully it was beneficial for you. And again, if you have any questions or anything like that, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.